Send greetings to Bereans, those who study the Word, and those, if you suffer through the class tonight, I hope we help you develop Christian character. So either way, hope you have an enjoyable class period tonight. We're going to look at Esther 6 and 7, and next week we're going to kind of walk through the end, because in a couple of weeks we're going to be going to the Ark, and the very end of Esther is just a very short section, and it talks about the Feast of Purim. And so I've asked Gary if he will fill in, and I just said, I'll just let you kind of, rather than, I don't like to give someone 8 verses that are really tiny, so we're going to kind of work our way through the end next week and kind of finish that, and then just tell him he can come in and just take it wherever he wants to. I cannot tell you where, but somewhere I read an article about this section. It was called The End of Haman's Rope. So I couldn't resist. And we have talked about the role of reversal and how things are the opposite from where they start. And I'm just processing for a second. God doesn't always even the score as quickly as is going to happen in this story. But one of the things we do want to talk about is that God is at work, and we haven't used the word providence a whole lot, but got to listen to lessons from James Baird years ago, and that was one of the things that he loved to talk about was the working of God in people's lives. And something that I think is very important about providence is that just because we're not going to have a book after the Bible named after us, or just because we're not, quote, something of a major character, God is as delighted to be working in your life as he is in the life of Abraham and Moses. And that's something we should always just kind of keep in mind, because sometimes it's easy to feel either just insignificant or what I'm doing is not significant. And yes, it may not be just earth-shattering, but 2 verses that always stick out with me. One is, even if I give a cup of what? Cold water, and you think, oh, well, how insignificant is that? And then you think, even the hairs of your head are numbered. And so with God, nothing is trivial, and nothing is minor, and nothing is unimportant. And a part of understanding providence as well is, over a period of time, we will look back and see the working of God, either through events, through things in our lives, some good and some unpleasant, sometimes some very difficult. And then we still look back, and we oftentimes will see the providence of God in hindsight better than we do at the time. Central idea: thanks to Esther's bravery, and reflecting earlier where, and this was to me what we called a defining life moment. If I perish, I perish. And if I can use kind of a contemporary expression, she was willing to lay it all on the line. If I perish, I perish. And that was a defining moment where she makes that choice to do that. And look at all then the consequences that are going to take place in her life because of that. In 2014, I did 4 funerals the first 12 days, and had just finished doing 35 funerals in 2013. And I'm not complaining, but I'm just telling you that takes a lot out of you. Well, as the year goes by, I get a call from Levi's mom and dad, and I think she was 6 weeks old. They put her to bed. The last time they talked to her and touched her was like 11:30. And when they woke up the next morning, she had died that night. He was in the military, so there was a whole protocol. He had to call like his commanding officer, and someone from the base had to come out, and someone from the police department had to come out, and a detective had to come out. I mean, there was just this whole protocol of things that had to happen. And this is just burnt in my mind. The coffin is like this, literally. And it didn't have little rails on it. It had little finger holes. And so 4 guys carried the coffin out, and they were on either side, and there was like a finger hold at the front and the back after we had finished. But what do you say to godly Christian people who've lost a 6-week-old daughter through the night? I was out at OC processing and thinking about this and ran across Stafford North, and I said, you know, I've recently done quite a few funerals, but 6-week-old girl, I mean, this is just a whole different relationship. And with a smile, Stafford North said, you know, he said, what a wonderful time to talk about heaven. He said, the jury is still out on their living kids, if they'll be there, but this girl never got a chance to sin. And so what a wonderful time to talk to people with a great sense of confidence about heaven and the nature of heaven. When I was a student, and pardon me, and of course Brother North is gone, some of our older teachers, we wondered if they'd gotten off the ark with Noah. And, you know, we're 18 years old, so give us a break. But anyway, you know, and I just said, well, Stafford, you've been teaching on Daniel and Revelation for at least half a century. What comes to mind when you think of heaven? I mean, just like that. He said, oh, behold, I make all things new. And he said, I'm confident that the greatest act of creation since Genesis 1 has yet to take place. And there will be a newness about heaven that none of us on this side of eternity will ever be able to comprehend until we get there. So Kelly, there it was. There was like a foothold. There was a place to start to talk to godly people about the loss of a 6-week-old baby. Maybe 2 months later, Sheila's grandmother, Nanny, passed away, and she was 105. Do you see what I'm thinking about? I mean, what a sobering contrast that here just previously, then I've done a service for a 6-week-old little girl, and then here is the beloved Nanny that's 105. And she wasn't a big lecturer. She was a very gracious, a very lovely lady, but 2 of the kids had got to see her during the last month of her life, and she quoted the 23rd Psalm to them and exhorted them to live holy and righteous and godly lives in this present age. Isn't that amazing? That's what I say, it wasn't a lecture, it was just, well, we're having this conversation, and while we're having this conversation, she just breaks into and quotes the whole 23rd Psalm about the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Those kids will never forget that. Well, here came the thing, you know, children, spouses, grandchildren, and then the guy said, we don't have enough paper for great and great and great great grandchildren. Because by the time you did the family tree, it was so extensive, because she's 105. And at the graveside, I just asked, what's the difference in doing a funeral for a 6-week-old girl and a godly 105-year-old woman? And I said, it's you and I. And just our very existence is a statement about the providence of God. And tonight, and I don't know if joy is not the right word, but it's nice occasionally to see someone who's plotting evil, for one, for it not to hatch, and then 2, for it to come back upon them. And the whole thing starts because bravery, for everything there's a season. There's a time and a purpose for every matter under heaven. There's a time to be born. There's a time to die. And here it comes. There's a time to speak. And there's a time to keep silent. And because Esther chose to speak at that moment, that was a defining moment both for her immediate family, and for the Jewish nation. We spent a lot of time talking about the word prudence, and prudence is a sense of timing, and it's a part of the wisdom cluster of words. But prudence is the ability to say the right thing at the right time. And I won't go through it again. I was a terrible example of imprudence in speaking with my wife once when she was really upset, and that was not a good sense of timing. And that's something for us to grow and to learn in. It's not only learning when to say something, but it's the timing, and then a lot of times the tone that we use during those times is really, really important. Our aim, I want to identify character traits in Haman that led to his downfall. So two of the things we've looked at in terms of, and if we were just doing a literature class, two of the literary features of this book that really stand out is that the events leading up to feasts, which we're going to look at, and then there's this constant role reversal where someone starts early in the book, then there's going to be a reversal, and tonight is going to be actually a fatal reversal because of the plans that Haman had made. So look at number 2 at the very top. One Hebrew word is used 46 times, and 26 of these are in the book of Esther. And it will be translated different ways, like, for example, in your translations, our word banquet, the word feasting, the word drinking, dinner. So there's a whole cluster of words that are like this, and it would take more time to explain this to your grandchildren, but most of you remember we used to be able to buy Dr. Pepper in cardboard cartons, and you picked up 6 of them in a carton. And that's what I think of biblical words. When you pick up a word, there's oftentimes little compartments that the word means in a different context. And look at the diversity, the variety, and the frequency of feasts, eating, banquets, and dinner. And so one of the threads that works its all the way through the book of Esther are these multiple times of feasting and eating and drinking. But there are also 8 different banquets or eating times. So I did A1 and 2. The first, we're introduced to Xerxes, and in Hebrew, Ahasuerus, banquet for the nobility. At the same time, Vashti is having a banquet for the women. And then B1, Esther has a coronation banquet. And then we're going to be looking tonight, there was the first banquet that we touched on last week, the C1 and C2. Esther's second banquet for the king and Haman, and this is where she's going to expose the plot. Then the Jews are going to be involved in feasting, in celebrating Mordecai's promotion. And at the very end, the Feast of Purim. And Purim has to do again with that idea of the casting of lots. And when Haman is deciding when he's going to bring this tragedy upon the Jewish people, the Purim, it was the casting of lots, and hence the name of that. And so the first original feast and then regulations about that, and this will come down to the Jewish people over time as a 2-day feast. So in Esther 6, we're informed of the events that happened the day before the second feast. So the first one has happened. Esther, because he extended the scepter to her and she was allowed to come in, she requested to have a dinner with just the 3 of them, with herself, the king, and Haman. And then Haman goes home. He's all thrilled to death because he's had this event take place. And the anger and the rage and the hatred within his heart has both caused him to do things and will be a part of his downfall from there. And so this, again, is the beginning of a major role reversal that's going to take place in the book. And so Haman is going to be encouraged. And I can't even imagine building something 75 feet high. Some of our translations, and I'll just go ahead and say this, we won't do it all the time. Some will use the word hang, and then on some of these, it's like to impale. So depending upon, again, here's one of these words that sometimes has a blended meaning. But regardless, building something 75 feet high to kill somebody is just a little over the top. And that's the nature of the plot and the plan that has been hatched. And Haman could never anticipate what's going to take place by the time we're through. So we're in Esther chapter 6 and verse 1. On that night, the king could not sleep. And we're going to end with this. Oh, was this an accident? On that night, and this is between the first feast and the second feast, and Haman is already making plans to kill Mordecai prematurely. The king gave orders to bring the book of memorial deeds, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about these two guys of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? And the king's young men who attended him said, well, nothing has been done for him. So 6:4. The king said, well, who's in the court? Well, Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai, and it's either hanged on the gallows, and there's the term wooden beam, that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, well, Haman is there, standing in the court, and said, oh, bring him in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to a man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, well, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman's whole life is very self-centered, both in terms of his own accomplishments, his achievements. And from Tim's lesson on Sunday, what a contrast for our Lord. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And we need to look after ourselves. We need to look after our own. But the contrast is going to be so stark between the two. And Mordecai, all through the story, is just primarily focused about himself. So Haman, thinking that the king's going to do this to him, says, well, for the man that the king delights, and this is 6 and 8, let the royal robes be brought which the king has worn, the horse that the king has ridden, 3, on whose head a royal crown or a headdress is set. Let the robes and the horses be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horses through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall be done to the man to whom the king delights to honor. And he's just thinking this is going to be fabulous because the king obviously is wanting to honor me. Role reversal. Wouldn't you love to see his face? The king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes, the horse, as you have said, and do this to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, and leave nothing that you have mentioned out. Can I just do this? It's like, oh no. So Haman took the robe, the horse, and dressed Mordecai. I mean, doesn't this just kill his soul? You know, here's a guy, every time he goes out, he won't bow down and, acknowledge him or whatever. And there's just been this grudge and this hatred that's festered. And then here he is doing all these things and taking him through the city. And I can just imagine this was a horrible experience for him. Shouting, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. And notice, Haman hurried to his house, mourning, and with his head covered. See what we're talking about? How the writer so often will do this role reversal He's so excited he's going to go to the king. He's finally going to get this guy hung. He's got the gallows prepared, and everything is just going really great. And then he gives all of these instructions on what he thinks will be done to himself. And then he is the one who does that to Mordecai. Haman told his wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. The wise man and his wife Jerish said, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were yet talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to, and this will be the second feast that Esther had prepared. So here's these reversal of roles and fortunes. The king discovers nothing's been done to reward Mordecai. What will be done for the one that kings honor? Haman wants to do things that would basically flatter himself. And then the shame and the humiliation that all of these things that he anticipated being done for him are done to his enemy. And we use the word prophecy in quotations, but the wife is correct that things are not going well. So we're now in chapter 7. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And let me just pause for a second. One of the things we talked about last week was let me just process a second and think the best way to say this. Sometimes prudence will use a person's weakness in order to do the things that are right and good. And what I'm saying is that the queen just didn't blurt out what she wanted, and knowing the nature of the king, and again, the prudence of organizing the first one, and then the second one, there's a sense of anticipation. But when we come to it, notice she's very thoughtful, she's very respectful, and if you've been fasting for 3 days and not eating and drinking, can I use the word rehearsed? I'm confident she has rehearsed this in her mind before she does that. Wouldn't you like to check her blood pressure and her heart rate when she first goes into the king? And then here it is during the second banquet. And notice what takes place. As they were drinking wine after the feast, which he was prone to do, the king again said, "Well, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It will be granted, and what is your request? Even half of my kingdom." And she answered, and here's the prudence, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request." 7:4. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. And if we'd been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Back when we were looking at this, defining the moment, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. I think one of the things that takes place within her making this decision is her choice to identify with my people. And you stop and think, at different times in Scripture, people have had a choice to identify with my people. Moses chose to suffer affliction for the people of God or with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. A favorite lesson, and this is a bit of historical imagination, but this happened. We don't know all the details, but this happened. Can you imagine being Moses' mother, and Sis comes back and tells you, yes, Pharaoh's daughter has found him, and yes, he's been allowed to live. And then you get to think, and here I am, a slave woman living in this hut, and my son's going to go live in the gold and glitter of Pharaoh's palace. Mom, what are you going to do every day that you still have hands on this little boy before he goes to live in Pharaoh's palace? You may have saved his life and cost his soul if you don't help him to identify who he is. And so, again, role reversal, an orphan. Esther's mom and dad have died. An older cousin adopts her, raises her up, and then what are the odds that an orphan becomes the queen? And wouldn't it have been easy to hide behind the robes, behind the crown, and everything else, and identify with the king, but she identifies with her people. And that defining moment comes out again because what has been done is against me, but very specifically against my people. 7 and 5, King Ahasuerus said to Esther, well, who is he? Where is he? And who has dared to do this? And again, do you see the prudence? If the first night she had said, oh, it's that sorry guy right there, and then there'd been this big discussion and everything, and she's been very thoughtful, she's been very timely, and all those words like prudence and discretion and insight are things that she is using both to analyze who she is talking to, what needs to be said, and when is the best time to say it. So here it comes. A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman, and then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So we're in 7:7. The king arose in his wrath, which he was prone to do, from the wine drinking and went to the palace garden. Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. The king, returning from the palace garden to the place they were drinking, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. The king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence in my house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. And then one of the eunuchs in attendance said, the gallows, wooden beam that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, and that's what the king had discovered when they read the book. This is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, 75 feet. And the king said, hang him on that. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the wrath of the king was abated. One of the verses that I really just ponder and think about a lot is that when Jesus says, judge not that you be not judged, for with the measure that you use, it will be measured to you. And I'm very confident, no hesitation, no doubt at all. There are some things that are just totally black and white every time in every situation, and this is right and this is wrong, with nothing in between. But having said that, on the day of judgment, what would be fairer than to use the measure that we have used on other people for God to use on us? Do you see why I've thought about this an awful lot? I mean, he's God, and by the coming of Jesus, he will judge the intents and the heart of people. But being God, and like I said, there are things that are just right and wrong every time, but Jesus is very specific. Do not judge, that you be not judged. Well, when are you going to be judged? Could be ongoing, but it could be also at the end of the day. And then he says, and with the measure that you use, it will be measured unto you. Just something to ponder and something to think about. And that's why my expression is, when it comes to grace and it comes to forgiveness, I don't want a teaspoon, I don't want a measuring cup, I don't want a shovel, I want a front-end loader. And anytime we can extend forgiveness to other people, we need to do that. Remember, we talked about, and this was very early, and I still shudder. He was flying from West Coast toward the east, And, sorry, I've got Max Dobson. Who was the Dobson that wrote the family books? James. Sorry, Coach Dobson was just such a dear person. James Dobson, the author, was flying, and the guy next to him was blind. And, long trip. Some point he asked him, and he said, yes. One of my competitors, business competitors, hired someone to throw acid in my eyes, and I lost my sight. And so as the flight goes on, the conversation unfolds. Well, what have you done? Well, without him knowing it twice, I have made investments and loans in his company to keep his company functioning. And he said, wait a minute. This is the guy that threw acid on your eyes. And he said, yes, I've lost once, but I don't want to lose twice. I may have lost my sight, but I don't want to lose my soul with anger and retaliation. Wouldn't that be an interesting conversation to be a part of? With the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. So the content of God's judgment on us, I think, still applies to the final judgment. But seldom in life do we get the opportunity to see the measure that one plans to harm another be turned back, and that's what's going to take place. So we're on 2:1. Esther's appearance and her conversation were planned in order to win the king's favor. Dressed in royal robes, notice, if it pleased the king, and she spoke in a manner which complemented what she wanted to do. And we used this a couple of weeks ago. We should all be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. I think it was 2005, my brother and I got to have a discussion with 2 Mormon elders. And the best seat in the house was next to my brother. We had a 3-month lead up from the signing to doing this. Kent had read 26 books on Mormonism. He had a file this big of just different things. And I'd keep saying, Kent, kill him with kindness. Kill him with kindness. And we'd have opportunities to respond, and Kent would literally run to the front and do his. And the first night, 780 people came. And the next Thursday night, 700 people came. Well, sister-in-law, Kent's wife, is in line with some ladies going to the restroom, and the 2 Mormon ladies are behind. And, of course, they have no idea this is the wife of one of the guys up front. And one of the Mormon ladies says to the other, she said, those Church of Christ people can be pretty mean sometimes. And Nancy's trying to think, oh no, she said, but I have figured out what these guys are up to. They're trying to kill us with kindness. Can I use her term? We have a better chance to win someone's heart by killing them with kindness than beating them with a club. We had 2 or 3 meetings, and Kent has an index in the front of his Book of Mormon with all these major passages. And both nights, but especially the second night, these guys would say something, and Kent would be giving them that's in the Book of the Dead, chapter 5, verse. So my brother's giving them book, chapter, and verse from their stuff for things that they couldn't quite remember. But like, for example, Joseph Smith taught that there were 10-foot Quaker-type men who lived on the moon. So we had a whole list of things that we thought if we bring up, we're going to lose credibility because people are saying, oh, surely you guys just, pull a rabbit out of the hat. So we had a whole list of things. Unless they bring that one up, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to do these 3 things. We're going to work on these. And like, for example, 13 times Joseph said that the capital of Mormonism was going to be built in Missouri. Where's the headquarters of Mormonism today? Salt Lake City. See what I'm saying? Most Mormons don't know that unless they've kind of read carefully, but 13 times, and Kent had book, chapter, and verse for each one of these. Well, that's a whole different thing than 10-foot Quakers on the moon. And there it is. You see in Esther, she studies the person that she's talking about in the situation, and this being wise as serpents and harmless as doves is something that's very important for us to do as Christians. So Haman's pride He boasts about his sons, his possessions, and we'll ask this a couple of times. Oh, it's an accident that he couldn't sleep. And the one book that they bring has Mordecai in it. See what I'm saying? You look back through the rearview mirror, and we're going to see God's providence working all through this story. One of the things we've talked a lot about in our Australian group is that we all need to be careful about not cultivating the root of bitterness. And you can see the passage in Hebrew, but the root of bitterness just calls people. I've had 3 close friends that at one time or another, things have happened, on and on it goes, and they left their wife, they left their kids, they left the Lord, they left the church, and it was the root of bitterness. And look at the tone of Haman's conversation, and you'll see that root of bitterness and the anger that he had toward Mordecai. In the Bible, the advice that wives give to their husband is not always good. Jezebel had advice that wasn't good. What did Job's wife say? Curse God and die? My brother's a freshman, and he gives a chapel talk on making the best of a bad situation. And he goes through and he talks about, well, this happened, and then here's Job's wife, this happened. And then this guy, his neighbor said, I don't know how to tell you this, but the milkman stops by and spends some time with your wife while you're gone. The guy says, well, I know that, but we have all the milk and eggs and cheese that we want, and I'm just making the best of a bad situation. Dean of Students calls my brother and says, Kent, we need to kind of review some of the things you're going to say. One of the guys on the track team is in a terrible pickle in his life, and he's sitting there and he's thinking, what else am I going to do to make my life a mess? And because he heard a talk on making the best of a bad situation, he starts talking to Coach Vaughn. He becomes a Christian. And within the last 2 years, this guy met Kent on campus, and he said, I have brought my daughter to teach in the nursing department at Oklahoma Christian because I heard a talk in chapel one day on making the best of a bad situation. And I decided to turn my whole life around. And he said that was the change where my life has never been the same because of that. So the pride is Haman's downfall. Look at 2:7. God is never in a hurry. He knows the end from the beginning, and his decrees are always right and on time. And here's a quote. People on board a ship from New York to England are free to do what they want to on the ship, but they aren't free to change the course of the ship. And again, at some time, look back, and in ways that you couldn't understand at the time, you'll see God's providence and God's leading going on. Pride, and there's a number of verses here, is the essence of most sin. And on the back page, I'm just going to do the ones in highlight. Most of these come from Proverbs. Pride comes, there's disgrace. Before destruction, a man's heart is haughty. Everyone is arrogant as abomination. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. You see a man wise in his own eyes. There's more hope for a fool. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that will he also reap. 1 Peter 5:5-7, clothe yourselves with humility. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I love things in Proverbs, and notice these things, and we'll be tying things together. Look at the decisions in Esther's life, and we're in Proverbs 16:3. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. What did she say? If I perish, I perish. The Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. And here's 2 Proverbs, and the first line is Haman. The second line is Mordecai. Proverbs 18:12, before destruction a man's heart is haughty. Humility goes before honor. Proverbs 29:23, Haman, a man's pride will bring him low, but he who is lowly in spirit will honor. And I love this. The character of 2 different men is separated by a comma. Which side of the comma do you live on? encourage you, take this home, look at it, and look at Proverbs 18:12, Proverbs 29:23. The character of two men is separated by a comma. Which side of the comma are we going to live on? So even after Haman's gone, we're going to see this next week, there were disastrous consequences of the evil. And we look back and we see in his time and in his season, God working things out providentially in the book. So here's God working, Job 4:8. I have seen those who iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and the blast of his anger they're consumed. For whatsoever a man sows, that will he also reap. If he sows to the flesh, from the flesh he'll reap corruption. If he flows through the Spirit, he will reap eternal life. So thought questions. And again, here's that statement from the very beginning. We learn more about the work of God through the rearview mirror than we do the windshield. And I'm just confident over and over and again, I may not understand exactly what's going on today, but in God's time I'll look back and say, okay, I can understand that. God moves in a mysterious way, his comfort to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. And when things happen, sometimes good and sometimes bad, don't fail to realize God hasn't left, God hasn't moved, and in time we'll see things that happen. So, an accident, the king can't sleep. There's 100 things he could do. He calls in the book, hears about Mordecai. An accident, Haman is close by, come in and do this. And here's our closing thought. Never confuse God's silence for God's absence. Never confuse God's silence for God's absence. His name is not in the book, but looking back, we see the providence of God working in each of the people and in each of the chapters. And Lord willing, we'll see how that comes about to bring about the Feast of Purim if Christ hadn't come back before next week. God bless.